Welcome to Undertold Verbatim. I'm Solveig Rennan for the Undertold Stories Project. Normally, we report from all over the world for PBS NewsHour. We talk to experts and people making a difference in their communities. In this podcast, we revisit those undertold stories to share extended interviews we've done with changemakers around the world. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially after the killing of George Floyd, we're turning our focus to our home, the Twin Cities. After police killed George Floyd on May 25th, Minneapolis and St. Paul saw weeks of protest that spread across the world. We've been here before, but never has such a clear demand emerged from the demonstrations. Defund the police.
But I think that defunding the police has everything to do with our ability to reimagine different forms of public safety, different ways of emergency response.
That was City Council member Jeremiah Ellison, and he's not the only elected official trying to build an alternative to a police department. The Minneapolis City Council unanimously advanced a proposal at the end of June to create a new Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. Their next goal was to amend the city charter, which mandates a police department with a certain number of officers. The council hoped to put that question before voters, but the Minneapolis Charter Commission, court-appointed and not elected, had the ultimate say and voted effectively to keep the issue off the November ballot. That decision sat well with Mayor Jacob Frey, who's opposed the defunding campaign.
We have all this anger and frustration and sadness. There's all of this energy, and it's our obligation to channel that energy and harness it towards something that is specific and productive, not vague and ambiguous.
Amid the debate, Minneapolis has seen a spike in violent crime and a record number of complaints against the department since the city erupted in protests after Floyd's killing.
I don't care if you're mad at the people. I don't care if your feelings are hurt by the way that people are treating you. As long as you're wearing the blue uniform, you have to do your job.
Throughout the summer, we've followed the Defund the Police debate. To find out what a police-free future might look like, our correspondent Fred to Sam Lazaro has talked with city leaders and community members, like Tyrone Hartwell of the Minnesota Freedom Fighters, a private security force of mostly black men.
Sarge was with the fire department. You got Papa Bear, who runs his own business.
Dressed in a t-shirt uniform and armed with assault rifles and handguns, Hartwell and some of the freedom fighters told us they answered a call from the local NAACP to protect North Minneapolis during the George Floyd protests.
We all come from different walks of life, but we all got one cause, and that's to be in one neighborhood and make sure that it's safe, it's peaceful, to kind of connect the communication skills between the police officers and the community to make sure that everybody is okay.
What brought you guys together? How did you guys learn of each other? You might have known each other socially, but how did you get together and decide on this thing?
Well, we honestly did know each other. They had an all call out for anybody, all males in the neighborhood.
What are you trying to do? What's your mission right now?
Our mission is to keep our community safe, again, and to bridge the gap between police and community. Right now we have a big issue with that. Whenever the police arrive, I feel like sometimes they have a gap in the communication. Cultural barriers. They try to treat everybody the same, and I think it's one of those things where you can't. Everybody in every situation is different. You know what I'm saying, when dealing with people. So we kind of want to be that bridge, that gap. We'll say, hey, let us try to get the situation to where you can at least communicate with them.
Do the police not have credibility in the community? Talk about the communication gap that you're trying to fill. Let me put it down.
At this point, we can talk about our own kids. Let's say that my own daughter is afraid of the police at this point. So that should show you the credibility right there. My daughter is afraid of them, and my daughter is 10 years old. It's one of those things where that's where the gap, that's where that fall down happens with the youth. So if the kids that's this small are afraid of the police, what does that tell you about the police?
And what are the gaps then specifically in the way, the police have conducted themselves that you'd like to see change? What kind of reforms?
I don't want to make it a racial issue, but it is a racial issue. The way the police approach me, I've been in my own situation. I'll say, I'm a big black guy. I'm already a threat. So when they approach me, if I question them, that's resisting arrest. But if I was a big white guy and I questioned you, they'll sit there and they'll discuss it with me. They'll go back and forth with me. But my skin tone make me a threat, and that's a problem.
Well, what does the MPD think of you, best you can tell?
We have a lot of communications going back and forth with them. Chief Arredondo, we speak with him. So anything that we do communicate with the police. Being here today, we communicated with the police. When we go to St. Paul, we communicate with the police. So we have an active relationship with the police department. So it's no riffraff between us. Again, this is why we say we're not trying to replace the police department. Let's say we're not trying to replace. We're just trying to help. We're trying to be a part of the solution. We're tired of waking up, looking at the news or looking at another Facebook video with another person of my skin tone shot down, strangled, whatever is the issue, because a lack of communication, a lack of discipline, a lack of understanding.
I would caution us against this concept that the only thing we need is nicer policing.
During the riots and looting earlier this summer, City Council member Jeremiah Ellison patrolled North Minneapolis alongside some of the freedom fighters. But he parts company with the group when it comes to improving policing or reforming the department, which he wants to abolish.
Is it preferable if police live in the neighborhoods or the cities that they patrol? Sure. Does it necessarily prevent things like police killings from happening? No, it doesn't. Is it preferable if you have a diverse workforce on your police force? Yeah, sure. But does that mean that a black officer isn't also capable of committing a violation of someone's rights, of taking their life? 2 of the 4 officers in the George Floyd case are not white. One's Asian American, one is black. And so I think that we also need to, challenge this idea that all we really need is nicer policing. I don't think that we have a personnel problem, right? And I think this idea that all we need is nicer policing, it imagines that all we have is a personnel problem. And if we just get the right people, then everything will be fixed. If we just get the right people in charge, if we just get the right people on the force, and I don't think that's the case. I think that we have a system problem, and I think that good people are going to be capable of committing heinous acts if we keep the system the way it is.
And what does defunding mean to you as you try to define it to people?
I think that defunding the police has everything to do with our ability to reimagine different forms of public safety, different ways of emergency response. Without that, we really don't have a pathway to defund, because we won't have anything to refund it to. I think that we're committed to that work. We saw some of that in our budget revision that we had to do with because of coronavirus, but it offered us an opportunity to make some considerations about this year's police budget as well. And what we found was that there aren't a ton of programs ready to go, ready to be taken to scale. And so I think that we've got to solve that problem first if we want to be in a serious position to have this conversation moving into the future. In Minneapolis, the police department is 152 years old. Some police departments are older, some are younger, but in Minneapolis, it's 152 years old. Not only is the police department 152 years old, but policing as a concept has had a complete monopoly on public safety. And so we're not going to undo policing's monopoly on public safety of 152 years in just a couple of months, right? We've got to build an alternative. I believe that policing, especially given the amount of purview that we've put under the banner of policing, has been a failure in a lot of ways. And I don't just mean a failure because it has perpetuated the kind of harm that you see in police killings and things that fall well short of police killings that still constitute harm. But it also fails to keep people safe proactively. So I believe that policing as an institution has failed. But you're not going to be able to undo policing's monopoly on public safety just in a couple of short months when we're talking about 100-plus year legacies here.
Mm-hmm. Can you enumerate maybe a few specific items or approaches that are alternatives to the traditional policing that you've had in Minneapolis? What items in your mind show some promise that might be scaled up in time that you're considering?
Right. Well, I think that we've got to consider public safety in, like, I'd say 3 phases. One, we've got to allow ourselves to imagine that we have the ability to prevent some crime, prevent some violence from happening, right? And so, and right now, we don't do prevention in any kind of real way. We have to have, I think, remedy for people who have been harmed, right, by crime, by violence. And then we have to have, I think, consequences for those who have caused the harm. Right now, we don't have a 3-phased approach. We have 1 phase. We have consequences for those who have caused harm. And if we can't find them, no consequences, no remedy for the people who have been harmed, and certainly no prevention to make sure that people are safe in the first place. So I think we've got to start with prevention. Right now, the Office of Violence Prevention is a relatively young office. We've been funding it for a little under 2 years now. Some of the work that OVP has done has existed in the city in various forms, kind of spread out. But 2 years ago, we finally coalesced those things under one banner within the health department with the Office of Violence Prevention. And they do a number of things. One is they gather intelligence. They find out who are the people who cause violence, right? Because the people who are the perpetrators of violence are often most likely going to be the victims of violence as well. And so if we can identify those folks, if we can identify who they have conflicts with, then we can predict when a violent incident is going to occur and hopefully go to interrupt that incident before it occurs. It's been a small program, a staff of 4, right? 5 people in the last 2 years, give or take. And so now we're finally in a position where we can take the Office of Violence Prevention's programs, like GVI is one of their programs. Now that it's grown a little, we can beef it up more and make it into a full-on violence interrupters program, right? You see they have this in Philadelphia, they have this in places like Chicago. And I think that if we continue to pump resources into programs like that and stop making them little tiny departments tucked into other departments, if we allow programs like that to really be taken to scale, I think we're going to save a lot of lives on the front end, not just respond to them after the fact. The other is not a program that we have at the city, but it's another municipal program over at the county that deals with mental health crises. We did an analysis last year of the top 5 most time-consuming calls for a police officer, and one of them was a EDP call, an emotionally disturbed persons call. One of the most time-consuming calls. Not only are police not trained to deal with emotionally disturbed persons, they often escalate the situations and turn them into complete failures. And so we set police up to fail when we ask them to respond to those calls. The police then, in turn, fail when they're at those calls. And meanwhile, we could deploy professionals who know how to handle that situation if we were willing to say that's not a police duty, that's going to be a mental health responder's duty.
Talk a little bit about what is now happening or being reported and whether there's any causality, and that is in the spike that Minneapolis, like several cities, is seeing in violent crimes, for example, in this city. Is that somehow connected to the whole controversy that the defunding initiative has caused for whatever reason? I mean, are they related?
Sure. I guess to answer that question, you'd have to look at the spike in violence in Ferguson and say, and see what conversations were they having in Ferguson after the killing of Mike Brown. Were people calling for reimagining of public safety? Were they saying defund the police then? I don't think that conversation was necessarily happening, and yet, after a police killing, you saw this spike in violence there. You saw the same thing happen in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray. Were people calling for defunding the police then? No, they weren't. And yet, after the killing of Freddie Gray, you see the spike in violence happening in a city like Baltimore. In Minneapolis, this is the only city where we're talking about a real reimagining of public safety, and we're putting stuff on the charter, and we're moving forward in a way that's calling for not just a reform of the police, but a transformation of public safety writ large. And we're the only city having that, and yet we're not the only city seeing this spike in violence. We're seeing it in a lot of major cities across the country. And so if the question is, is there any sort of correlation between this call for a better institution of safety and the rise in crime, I just think that there's no evidence of that.
There are people in the community who've said that the community hasn't been adequately consulted on this whole question, and that the council's moves are undermining the chief of police, who's the first African-American homegrown chief of police. What is your message to those folks?
I don't think that we can afford to take this conversation slowly. And I think that we have to engage everyone, right? We have to be in a position to engage everyone. But when it comes to things like the charter change, when it comes to funding programs like the Office of Violence Prevention and kickstarting a Cure Violence program to help prevent, or to help get ahead of some of the shootings that we've been seeing this summer, those are things that we can't necessarily wait for. This conversation is going to happen slowly. Again, we're dealing with an institution that's 152 years old. I think that we can be aggressive about this conversation now, and it'll still take 152 years before we've really perfected a new system of public safety. And so the conversation's gonna be slow. I think that in one way or another, every single person in the city of Minneapolis is gonna have a say-so in what a new form of public safety looks like. But I do think it's important that we move quickly and that we be responsive. I think that George Floyd didn't necessarily get to have a say-so in what kind of public safety response he got. And if we want to be in a position to prevent things like that from happening again, like Jamar Clark, Philando Castile wasn't in Minneapolis, but he was certainly in the metro area. And if we want to be in a position to prevent this from happening into the future, then we have to pick a direction. We have to head that way. And if ultimately people don't want to transform public safety, they'll get to have a say-so.
Mayor Jacob Frey has a much different idea of the direction Minneapolis should head. He wants reform, not abolition. Things like mentoring programs, personnel changes, or a different system to terminate problematic officers.
So there are two parts to the City Council's proposed charter amendment. The first, which is whether or not we will still have law enforcement, is entirely ambiguous. And I believe that when people go to the ballot box to vote on a charter amendment, they should know precisely what they are voting on. The second part to the City Council's proposed amendment is to shift the reporting structure so that the chief reports not just to me, as is presently the case, but the head of public safety reports to 14 different people, 13 council members and a mayor. That is a massive hit to accountability, and I'll tell you why. Right now, when things go wrong, it's very clear who to blame: the Chief Arredondo and myself. If down the road there are 14 different people that the head of public safety has to report to, it would just be one big finger-pointing contest. That is not a model that other cities use. That is not a model that furthers accountability, and it certainly doesn't provide clarity of direction to officers.
There are people who say, there have been attempts, there are innumerable attempts to reform this police department. It is run by the union, in the eyes of these folks, and it's irredeemable as currently structured. What gives you any optimism that this time will be different if you don't completely revamp the system, as many city councilors are proposing?
Well, right now, we have all this anger and frustration and sadness. There's all of this energy, and it's our obligation to channel that energy and harness it towards something that is specific and productive, not vague and ambiguous. And I do believe that the council's amendment is very vague and is very ambiguous in many instances. And so it's our job right now to put out that clear vision as to where we're going to go, what specifically that we're going to do, and how we're going to get there. Right now we need specificity, not a lack of clarity.
Do you worry about the optics of all of this? The optics, that is to say, that present images of chaos, of looting, of unrest, that feeds the narrative and makes a case, in some minds compelling, of outside intervention or for it?
The unrest following the killing of George Floyd has subsided in many ways. Does that mean that the work is done? Absolutely not. We still need to retain peace, we need to keep order, and we need to push for deep and structural change. That is the work in the months ahead.
And it can be done as the city charter is constructed today?
It can be done, And there are several positions that need to be changed even at the state level. So right now, when the chief or I terminate or discipline an officer, as much as 50% of the time, that officer gets returned right back to the department from which they came because of an arbitration system. In other words, an arbitrator overturns the decision from the chief and I, sending that individual right back to the department to continue to hurt public trust in our police officers. That provision still needs to change. And if we talk about culture, I mean, I'm a proponent of culture shift. We need a full culture shift in our police department. Culture, to a certain extent, is about personnel. It's about people. It's having the ability to bring the right officers with the right mentality into the police department. It's about having the ability to get the wrong officers out of the police department.
The Minnesota legislature did pass a police reform bill with a number of changes aimed at holding the police more accountable. But Mayor Frey thinks the measure falls short on some key issues.
I do think that the legislation could have and should have gone further. I think that we should be able to terminate officers for egregious misconduct, for instances where they're lying on a formal document, for instances where they used heavy force and then didn't get ultimately terminated because of an arbitration. That's something that needs to change right now. And there are instances where serious, awful force was used, where that officer was terminated, and then they were brought right back to the department. The chief and I need the ability to facilitate change. We need the ability to have a full-on culture shift, and part of that is having our termination decisions stick. And we can do it. I'm optimistic. I believe in our city, and we're going to do the hard work over the coming months to make the change that we all envision.
In some minds, that work is even harder now. In recent weeks, the police department has seen a large number of officers depart, more than 20% according to their union. Lisa Clemons left the force several years ago and founded an agency called A Mother's Love, which provides mentoring, de-escalates conflict, and supports families. She says the community feels left out in the debate over policing and public safety. Wearing a mask, she talked to Fred during a food distribution in North Minneapolis.
What does it feel like in Minneapolis today? Do you feel concerned about the level of safety since the tragedy of George Floyd's killing?
I think it's scary. I think the community has been left to fend for themselves. But I think we were left that way when COVID hit. And then once the riot happened after the murder of George Floyd, we were really left to take care of ourselves.
How so? Tell us some more.
I think when the city council came out with their statement of abolishing and dismantling and disbanding the police department, those incendiary terms, I think it created a lot of fear in the community, but it also at the same time created a brazen attitude for those who are engaged in that activity. They fear no one now. They at least feared a little bit of justice coming their way, but now they fear no one.
So you say that criminal elements feel a sense of impunity today?
Absolutely.
And that's because of the council's action?
I think it is because of the council's action. I think that they believe that the criminal element doesn't read the paper or watch the news or, have communications with people who are boots on the ground who know what's going on. I think that's something they've mistaken.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the police are culpable as well? I mean, are they slowing down their response times? I mean, we've heard anecdotally that that's another complication.
I think because I'm so connected, I think what people need to understand is how many bodies are out there responding to 911 calls and addressing the shootings and the homicides. There's not enough bodies on the street. At one point, there was 8 officers for a middle watch shift. You cannot police an entire precinct with 8 officers.
Mm. And you lay the blame for a lot of this at the feet of the city council.
And Chavez. And Officer Chavez. Absolutely. His actions created a reaction that was incendiary So both of their actions caught the citizens in the middle.
You're left here with an officer corps that is diminishing in size and demoralized.
Exactly. And a city that's still burning. Our city is still burning. You may not see fire, but our city is still burning.
Crime typically spikes in the summertime. Traditionally, it's spiking everywhere in the country in cities. Is there something special about Minneapolis this summer?
The crime here isn't spiking. This is a tsunami that we're facing here. And it's different because first you had COVID, where everybody was afraid, everybody was shut in, and then everything was shut down. So there was nothing for anybody to do, including our youth. And then you open back up a little bit, but now the violence is so bad that I really fear a lot more people getting killed by citizens who are engaged in, for people who are engaged in this criminal activity. You have to remember, we have a city council president who said if you call 911, you're showing your privilege, making the assumption that every person that was engaged in violence is a black person or a person of color, or the assumption that everyone who owns a home in the city of Minneapolis is white. Neither of those things are true.
And what do you say to people who's in this neighborhood that we've talked to who say, the response times are atrocious? I mean, we call and they never come.
They are.
For a lot of members of the, for a lot of people of color, calling the cops has never been, something you do because you feel it'll make you safer necessarily.
I think they have a right to feel that way. I do. I mean, I've worn a uniform before. So I do think they have a right to feel that way. I don't discount any of those feelings. I myself just almost had a car accident where somebody nearly took my car out with me and my 2 children in it. And I sat there for 10 minutes and still no police car. So when I called, it was because because their size is so low, they're only responding to priority 1 calls. And if there's no injury in that traffic accident, then they're not going to respond in a fast time. But I also know that there's not enough cops out there, period. But I make no excuses for slow response time. So if cops are not doing their job, they should quit. They should not be in that uniform. I don't care if you're mad at the people. I don't care if your feelings are hurt by the way that people are treating you. As long as you're wearing the blue uniform, you have to do your job.
And you fear that some of them are just slowing down on purpose?
I don't know that I fear that, but if it could be true, I would not discount it.
Do you think it's a plausible
absolutely.
possibility?
Absolutely. I think cops would probably feel like, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. I don't want to go out there and end up losing my livelihood because I have to take some action that nobody's going to ever believe was the right action. And I think a lot of people forget that.
In August, a group of mostly North Minneapolis activists filed a lawsuit against the city, backed by a law center allied with conservative political causes. It claims the council and mayor's actions have contributed to a rise in violence, and that the police department is below staffing levels required by the city charter. How do voters feel? Polling in August show 3 out of 4 Minneapolis residents support moving some policing funds to social services, but only 40% approve of reducing the department's size. We'll keep up our coverage as the movement continues or changes. Our interviews with Tyrone Hartwell, Jeremiah Ellison, Jacob Frey, and Lisa Clemons were originally featured in our story called Minneapolis Debates Defunding Police, which aired on PBS NewsHour on August 5th, 2020. To check out the full story, go to undertoldstories.org. This episode was written and hosted by me, Solveig Rennan, and produced by Simeon Lancaster. The interviews were conducted by our director, Fred de Sam Lazaro. You can find every Undertold Verbatim episode, virtual reality 360 experiences, and our entire library of Undertold news reports from around the world at undertoldstories.org. Undertold Verbatim is brought to you by the Undertold Stories Project based at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. As always, thanks for your support.